While the Greeks were stars in abstract thinking, they only rarely performed experiments to verify their theories. In fact, they didn't even have a word for experiment. But this changed in the Islamic world. Here we see the Book of Optics by Ibn al-Haytham, which reads more like a scientific textbook than anything written before it, as he consciously understood the need to verify all his claims with experiment. And instead of speaking of experience like the Greeks did when talking science, he used a new word, itabar. And in the medieval translation of the Book of Optics, this word became experimentum. In this work, he also explicitly wrote not to trust in authority, but only in demonstration, in experiment, which every person can verify for himself, and that only in this way can we distinguish truth from falsehood. And with this method, he managed to refute both Greek theories on light, and instead created a theory way closer to our modern understanding. Together with Aristotle, who claimed that scientific knowledge can only come from observation through the senses, and Ptolemy, who conducted the first quantitative controlled experiments, the Iraqi philosopher Ibn al-Haytham of the 11th century is seen as the father of science. He analyzed two Greek theories of vision. One of them curiously claimed that vision occurred by vision rays that were emitted by the eyes, and the other that vision was caused by sheets of atoms that are released by objects and enter our eyes. Ibn al-Haytham found a flaw in both theories and instead claimed that light was the cause of vision. Seemingly common sense today, but it took centuries to get to this conclusion. Let's take one of his arguments. Imagine suddenly looking at the night sky. You will notice that the stars become almost immediately visible, which according to the first Greek theory of vision, meant that these vision rays emanating from the eyes must have filled the entire universe in an instant, which Ibn al-Haytham said is absurd. And he showed through many experiments that all those hypothesized vision rays are actually always accompanied by a light ray moving in the opposite direction, making the vision rays redundant. And in showing this result, he encouraged the reader not to believe him on his word, but to confirm every step themselves by repeating his experiments. And he also stressed the fallibility of human thinking, requiring scientists not to defend, but actually to attack their own theories on all sides to get to the truth. So we have a lot to get to. Let's start. Hey, good to see you. This is Stephan, author of In Search of the Sublime. On this World History channel, we'll trace humanity's relentless pursuit of scientific truth, moral excellence and enlightenment. You'll meet anyone from Mesopotamian astronomers and Indian yogis to Greek philosophers and Enlightenment scientists. And you'll meet them firsthand using primary sources, giving you valuable insights that transcend the surface level understanding you get on other channels. So go check it out for yourself. Let's start. Let's start with some background story about Ibn al-Haytham. The Muslim scientist Ibn al-Haytham is said to have attempted to build a hydraulic system to regulate the annual flooding of the Nile. But when this plan failed, it was way too ambitious. He had to fear for his life, since the Caliph of Egypt at the time, nicknamed Hakim the Mad, had a very violent temper. To save his life, Ibn al-Haytham decided to pretend that he had gone mad. And this plan worked, although he did have to spend the rest of his life under house arrest. And there at home in his library, he wrote his most important scientific works. Ibn al-Haytham's most famous work is his Book of Optics, which was clearly inspired by Ptolemy's work, but surpassed it in various ways. To understand his improvements, we'll quickly discuss the two Greek theories of vision. The first is called the emission theory of vision, which was endorsed by the Greek philosophers Ptolemy and Euclid. They believed that we see because vision rays emerge from our eyes and feel the surroundings, as though they were the antennae of insects. Ptolemy did claim that light was also necessary for vision, for it brightens up the surfaces of objects. But distinct vision rays were then necessary to actually see those objects. And to be fair, an object like a book doesn't seem to be giving off light the same way a fire or a lamp does. It is not obvious at all that this book emits light. Euclid claimed that these rays were emitted from the eye in the shape of a cone. And since the radius of a cone becomes larger with distance, this allowed him to understand mathematically why objects look smaller when further away. That is to say, it explained perspective. We can see this in the image below. A tree close by completely fills our field of vision, but a tree further away does not. The atomists didn't agree, but formed an alternative theory of vision. They thought that all objects emit sheets of atoms, and that these atoms made visible images when they enter our eyes. Yet this model could not explain how the atoms from, for example, an entire mountain could form a very small image in someone's eyes. And the atomists also couldn't explain how objects could continuously send out atoms without ever reducing in size. And since we can't see in the dark, they also saw a use for light in vision. The atomist Lucretius, for example, claimed that light enlarges the pores between the atoms of the air, allowing the atoms of the objects to travel freely from the object to the eye. So the role of light here was to change the air to allow the atoms to travel through it. Very different from what we believe today. Ibn al-Haytham discusses both of these theories in his work. The emission theory he calls the theory of the mathematicians, for the cone theory required a lot of mathematics. And the atomist theory he called the theory of the physicists, and he concludes that they are two contrary doctrines. He said, it is either the case that one of them is true and the other false, or that they are both false, the truth being other than either of them. Or they both lead to one thing, which is the truth. And then he showed confidence in his own experimental method. He says, when the inquiry is rightly conducted and the investigation intensified, agreement will finally emerge and the difference will be settled. Ibn al-Haytham refuted Euclid's emission theory with a simple thought experiment. Imagine looking at the night sky with your eyes closed. When you then open your eyes, stars become about immediately visible. And in Euclid's theory, this would mean that the rays would instantaneously fill the entire universe, which is of course absurd. But Ibn al-Haytham did see the advantages of Euclid's cone theory, since it explains perspective. His solution was to assume that vision rays do not exist, but that instead sunlight enters the eye in the same cone shapes. In this way, he combined the theory of the mathematicians with the theory of the physicists. He agreed with the atomists that something is entering our eyes, in this case light instead of atoms. And he managed to save the successful cone geometry of the mathematicians, allowing for the explanation of perspective. So it was a beautiful fusion of these two takes. For this theory to work, he had to show that visual rays were redundant, not necessary. This is immediately apparent when looking at a light source such as a lamp. An intense light, he claims, can even have a blinding effect or hurt our eyes. And it can even produce after images visible when closing your eyes. And all these examples show directly that light is associated with vision. On top of this, all of this also happens when we look at the light through a mirror. That can also blind us and hurt us and produce after images, showing that light can also reflect against mirrors, just as Ptolemy had assumed that his vision rays reflected against mirrors to see objects. For other objects, such as a book, it is less clear that it emits light. Although the Greeks already did recognize that the moon was not itself a light source, but emits light through reflection of the light from the sun. So perhaps this also happens to our book, but with less intensity. You can now see it on your screen, because light from lamps reflects against the book into the camera. We read, "Light emanates in every direction from any luminous body, however it is illuminated. Thus, when the eye faces any visible object, whether a lamp or a book, that shines with some sort of illumination, light from that visible object will shine on the eye's surface. And it was shown that it is the property of light to affect sight, while it is in the nature of sight to be affected by light. And it is therefore fitting to say that sight senses the luminosity of a visible object only through the light that shines from it upon the eye." And in this way he made visual rays redundant, as the connection between visual objects and the eye is in all cases already performed by light. Yet, similar to the problem of the atomic theory, Ibn al-Haytham also had to explain how light from large objects, such as a mountain, can form a tiny image in the eye. The emission theory did not have this problem, as here the rays come out of the eyes and diverge towards the mountain. But the other way around, it becomes more complicated. Ibn al-Haytham attempted to solve this by assuming that only light perpendicular to the lens of the eye produces vision. For in this way, every point of a mountain corresponds to exactly one point on the retina. And you can see this in this image from Ibn al-Haytham. Here we see the objects with points A and B. And from these points we see light shining in all directions. But only the light that enters the eye perpendicular, which happens here and here, produces vision, according to Ibn al-Haytham. Quite a good theory, but not correct. And it would have to wait till the 17th century for the correct theory of the formation of images by lenses to form, in the work of Johannes Kepler. And now we finally come to why Ibn al-Haytham's work was important for the development of the scientific method. His book of optics reads like a scientific text beyond anything written until that point. For he, unlike anyone before him, consciously understood that every hypothesis requires experimental demonstration to make it credible, an idea he applied consistently throughout his work. Here he says it directly, quote, "Do not believe in Ptolemy's words in everything he says, without relying on a demonstration or calling on a proof." We continue, "This is how experts in the prophetic tradition have faith in prophets. May the blessing of God be upon them, but it is not the way that mathematicians have faith in specialists, in the demonstrative sciences." Again, impressive scientific thinking that we usually only associate with the Enlightenment period of Europe. To do this, he took small, careful steps, sticking close to sensory evidence. Even more so than in the optics of Ptolemy, which we discussed in the previous lecture. The work is packed with experimental demonstrations, including step-by-step descriptions of experimental setups, allowing the reader to confirm every step himself. To give an idea of how methodical he approaches the subject, he starts his work stating that we can, quote, "only see objects if there is an unobstructed straight line between the object and our eyes." And he then sets out to demonstrate this using rulers and sighting tubes. And as a result, he claims that vision occurs in straight lines. You can check it for yourself. He then does the same not just for vision, but for light. We read, "The light of the sun, when it enters through a hole into a dark chamber, the air of which is cloudy with dust or smoke, the light will appear to extend rectilinearly from the hole through which the light enters." Crucially, al-Haytham also used language to indicate that he was performing experiments as opposed to passive observation. Instead of using the word experience, as was custom among the Greeks, Ibn al-Haytham chose the Arabic word itabar, meaning going through a procedure. And as this word signified, he realized that it was more than just an observation. It required active involvement of the scientist. So, unlike the Greeks, he saw experiment as a distinct procedure from observation. And when his book of optics was later translated by medieval Europeans, they translated this word, itabar, as experimentum. Ibn al-Haytham also acknowledged the difficulty of gaining accurate knowledge and the fallibility of human thinking. The same thing that Francis Bacon, the founder of the scientific method in the West, later stressed. We read, "Certainty is difficult to achieve, for the truths are obscure, the ends hidden, the doubts manifold, the minds turbid, the reasoning various. The premises are gleaned from the senses, and the senses, which are our tools, are not immune from error. The inquirer, however diligent, is not infallible." The only way to overcome this problem, he claimed, is by grounding our theories with sensory data, and also by criticizing our own work relentlessly. We continue, "To find the truth is hard, and the way to it is rough, for the truths are immersed in uncertainties, and all men are naturally inclined to have faith in the scientists. That is, to trust them without double checking. But God has not protected scientists from error, nor has he made their science immune from shortcomings and defects. Had this not been the case, they would not have disagreed about anything in the sciences, nor would their opinions have differed in regard to the true nature of things, but the facts are otherwise. There are often many competing theories. The seeker after the truth is not one who studies the writing of the ancients, and following his natural disposition puts his trust in them, but rather the one who suspects his faith in them and questions what he gathers from them. The one who submits to argument and demonstration, and not to the sayings of a human being, whose nature is fraught with all kinds of imperfection and deficiency. The true thinker submits to argument and demonstration, and not to authority. That is the key." We continue, "Thus the duty of the man who investigates the writings of scientists, if learning the truth is his goal, is to make himself an enemy of all that he reads, and attack it from every side. He should also suspect himself as he performs his critical examination of it, so that he may avoid falling into either prejudice or leniency." An impressive understanding of the scientific method. Another early scientist worth noting is al-Fasiri from the 13th century, who in a commentary on al-Haytham's optics gave a beautiful description of the rainbow. He demonstrated his theory by studying how light refracts and reflects against a glass sphere filled with water, which he used as a model of a water droplet in the atmosphere. Very impressive. And thus unfolded the great achievements of Ibn al-Haytham. The next great step in the formulation of the scientific method came with Francis Bacon in the 16th century. And Francis Bacon managed to convince natural philosophers to take on his ideas, sparking the scientific revolution. But for now, I hope you were inspired, and if you want to learn more about the history of science or any other topic from world history, then read my book In Search of the Sublime. You can read it completely for free on worldhistorybook.com, or you can buy a physical copy on Amazon. Thanks so much for watching. Bye bye.